Hey, folks, so we're going to be getting started here with Saul in 2 more minutes. I wanted to go ahead and get the live stream started. So I can do a little bit of setup here, give you an opportunity to start thinking about your questions. So that's a big one here today. If you do have any questions, I want you to go ahead and put them into the chat. I will answer them. Well, I won't answer them. Saul will answer them as we're going here. And we're going to get started here in just another minute or so. So if you would like to go ahead and start thinking about questions. I do have a couple I'm going to start with today. Obviously, what we're talking about today is how to discuss the cases here, right? Obviously, Burnett versus NAR was the big one. That's the one we're going to be kind of starting out the discussion on. But really, there's other ones coming. More being filed. Seems like every couple of days we're hearing more news on this. So it's all fair game. The primary point of today's discussion is obviously how to talk about these things, right? So that's what I really want you to hone in on here is how to discuss these cases, how to talk about these topics. And we're going to get into a lot of detail here for you, try to give you, as much of a framework and kind of a concept, at least, on how to talk about some of the turmoil in the real estate industry right now. So we'll be getting started here in another 30 seconds. I just want to give everybody a chance to hop on. I did start a little early, so I want to wait till right at the top of the hour to start the discussion here with Saul. But we will be getting started in just a few more seconds. That just bought me a little bit of time to get situated, get the stream shared onto social media, and give all of you a chance to start preparing your questions. So as we get started here, we'll be getting started in, again, another 30 seconds or so. I want you to be thinking about what are some of the specific questions you have. I might be covering them. Hopefully I will. But if not, you can ask them, and I will put them up on the screen so that we can see the question and we can discuss it with Saul here. All right. So that's what we're going to be doing. So, okay, there we go. I was waiting for it to click over to the top of the hour to get started. So let's officially kick off our discussion. So with no further ado, I would like to welcome Saul Klein to the stage. Now, just a quick intro here. Saul, there's a lot you can say about Saul. The way I see Saul is that he is one of the top industry experts, especially when it comes to technology or using the internet in real estate. I've been reading some of the publications about some of these lawsuits, and he's the person being interviewed in these national level articles on the topic. Number one expert I could think of when it came to how to discuss a very complicated subject with your clients. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Saul Klein. Saul, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Nick, my pleasure. Great to be here. Great to talk about one of my favorite subjects on real estate.
Of course, yeah, and I see you talk about it all the time. I know you've been flying all over the country. You're speaking at all these events. So are you getting tired of talking about this particular topic yet?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's something new every day. And because there is, right, keeps it interesting for me. It's a critical piece. People in real estate are really hyper alerted to antitrust. Always have been, right? So now it's front and center. And so people are very interested in it. And consumers are very interested in it because the press is playing it. And so I see it as a great opportunity for people who sell real estate, who want to create content. There's some really relevant content out here now that that you can really use to build trust and confidence in your relationship with buyers and sellers.
Interesting. Yeah. And I'm glad to hear you say that, because I've seen, obviously everybody's talking about this. I've seen a lot of opinions, some of which were almost just ignore it, hide it, pretend like it's not happening, and I like the idea that there's some opportunity here, because I agree. I mean, any disruption always leads to, eventually at least, opportunity, right? So let's dive straight in, right? So we're talking about how to, this will obviously help somebody that wants to discuss this with their clients, one-on-one conversations in their sales meetings, all of that. But I think we want to start with the primary topic today, which is I'm going to make a video about this, right? I'm going to get proactive, get out in front of my audience, and share some thoughts about this lawsuit and about the other pending lawsuits. Let's start with what are some of the key things that an agent should say in that video?
Well, so first of all, I think this would be a series of videos.
Okay.
So you can look at this as doing a series of videos talking about the different elements here. And some of the primary elements are, of course, the one everybody's read about recently is the Sitzer-Burnett case, which is in Missouri. Now, all of these cases revolve around the offer of compensation. So and this is a great thing to talk about, how do you get paid in real estate? Why do you get paid? How does the money flow in a real estate transaction? Buyers and sellers should know about this anyway. And now it's front and center, because what's being challenged in these lawsuits is the structure of the multiple listing service, and a key element of multiple listing services, which is the broker compensation rule. So you could do a video on the broker compensation rule and how commission flows from the seller to the listing broker, and from the listing broker to people who represent the buyer. And that's a couple of minute conversation in and of itself. So the first thing is to talk about is understanding compensation in real estate, and then how it ties into this litigation. What are the plaintiffs saying in this case? And what they're saying is that sellers are not aware of, or were not made aware of to the degree required, of the fact that compensation was flowing to a representative of the buyer, and sellers really didn't have an opportunity to negotiate that. And that the structure of MLS is really conspiracy and collusion to elevate commissions. And so here's the important point is everybody's reading this. And so people that are reading, I know I'm getting calls from people who I haven't heard from in a long time. They want to know, did you see this article? Did you read this? Right? Have you seen this? And so here's a perfect opportunity to demonstrate your expertise, which builds trust and confidence in sales relationships. And Nick, what you're talking about is doing it in a video to be able, and then send people to somewhere where they can view this video, or sending a link out where they can view you talking about a very relevant topic. So you shouldn't be afraid to talk about compensation, the way you're compensated, the way the industry compensates people who list and sell real estate. So that's the subject, and that's the problem with the litigation, is it's revolving around this issue of compensation. So that's the first thing I'd talk about, and I'd feel real comfortable talking about, how do we get paid in real estate transactions? What do we do to get paid? What value do I bring to the table so that I do get paid? What value does somebody who represents the buyer in a transaction, what value do they bring to the table? Now, here's something that people leave out, that if you're listing a property for sale, your seller benefits by having a buyer represented by a fiduciary. And we often don't talk about that. But if I'm selling my house, I want somebody who when a buyer comes in, I want somebody to come in that represents them and has a fiduciary duty to that buyer, because an unrepresented person might bring me added liability, and I don't want that.
Interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like first step here is something that everybody should have already been doing, but a lot of them are not, which is just educating their marketplace about some of these rather complicated topics, right? This idea of how do you make money, transparency on that front. So that's great. I think that's a good starting point. I love.
Now what you want to do is say, I belong to an MLS. What is an MLS? It's a multiple listing service. What does that mean? That means that when I take a listing, I put it into a publication. It's online, and it gets distributed to everybody else who sells real estate in my community. So I'm going to expose your property to a broad audience, and that benefits you. So just the conversation around multiple listing services and what they are and how they benefit the seller of the property, that's a great conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's a good idea. So let's take it the next step then, right? So we got these sort of educational content, hopefully kind of getting in front of this conversation, probably teaching people stuff they just are not aware of, right? So then there's a second question in my mind, which is, we got these customers, they're reading these articles, right? These sort of national level articles, the stuff that's being written by New York Times and Forbes and everybody else. They're, especially the headlines are not the nicest looking, right? So I guess, some of the people, it seems like, are coming out of having read that content, almost assuming that like everything is changing right now, like, oh, now I saw somebody the other day, like, now I don't need a buyer's agent at all. I'm just going to start looking at houses and, do everything myself. I mean, what do you think an agent could be talking about in their content to proactively address that? Should they mention that kind of stuff and say, here's why that's a bad idea? is there ways to talk about it, without getting into it? I mean, let's kind of take, like, let's say we're trying to address some of that content. What are some ideas you have there?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's 5 major lawsuits.
Okay.
5. And so I think that that's worth addressing, that there are 5 lawsuits. And I think it's even valuable to know, knowledge is power, right? It's valuable to know what those 5 lawsuits are. And for the audience, those 5 lawsuits are the case that you read about with a $5 billion, see, that got a lot of attention, right? A $5 billion judgment, and it was really 1.78. See, numbers are impressive. You should know the numbers. Yeah. It's a $1.78 billion judgment, and because it's antitrust, it's tripled automatically. It's tripled. So you triple that, you're at $5 billion. So that's important to know. That's it, but that's a case in Missouri. That's one case. There's another case in Illinois, and that's Merrill, Moehlr. And that case is even bigger. That's in the estimated to be in the tens of billions of dollars. Hasn't gone to trial yet. And that case, same issue, buyer broker compensation paid for by the seller. Same issue. 25 top MLSs in the country are named, and big damages expected out of that one. That's the second case. The third case is the MLS in the Boston area, MLS PIN, Private Property Information Network. And then the next one just filed October 31st is Gibson, filed by the same attorney that filed the Merrill case. So I say there are 5 cases now, 5 big ones. There's more coming. There's 5 big ones. 4 of them are civil cases. They're civil cases. The 5th one is the National Association of Realtors against the Department of Justice. But 4 of them are civil cases. They're antitrust cases. They're going to be tried jurisdiction by jurisdiction. The first decision is in. The decision is that sellers were overcharged, but they weren't overcharged if you analyze it. And if you look at the value that's brought to the buyer and the seller in a real estate transaction, and that's the point you want to make. And now we're back to something that we've been telling realtors that they need to do forever, it seems, and that is, what's your value proposition? Why are you worth what you're worth? And so you need to make that. Here's an opportunity for you to make that case, because people want to know, what is this case about? It's about commissions, overcharging the sellers who pay the commissions in a real estate transaction. And why do you believe there's a value and a benefit to the sellers when you list a property? And so this is your chance to sell yourself, right? And what are all the things that you normally say in a listing presentation? Here, now you can put it in the context of litigation, where a jury, 12 people, not necessarily knowledgeable, 12 people have said that sellers didn't get their money's worth. That's the case. And you're going to say you believe that they did get their money's worth. And the way you're going to convey that is in all the things that in your normal discussion. How do you convey your value proposition to the seller, or to the buyer for that matter, right? And so now you're just going to do that in the context of litigation. Now you got people's attention, because they're
nice. Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, and that's, I like that approach, right? Because I mean, I think in some ways there's a lot of temptation with something like this, probably to be defensive, right? To get out there, well, there's this case and it's all nonsense and it's not fair, and but it's been decided right now. The news is out, the settlement's out there, and obviously there'll be appeals and all that'll come out. But I like the approach of sort of flipping the script and saying, look, I'm going to be the leading voice here, right? So I mean, there's one case, people have heard about it. There's actually 5, as you pointed out, right? So in some ways, I think I would be a little nervous sort of going out and telling my audience, hey, there's actually 5 of these, right? But I like that idea that gets you in front of it, right? Now you're leading the conversation. Now you're able to explain, kind of the logic behind the cases, some of the technical details. And then, I love the idea that, you're ultimately pitching yourself, right? You're showing you're basically demonstrating how you stand apart, especially from your potential competition. So that's great. So you get through this, right? You start talking about this. I mean, so what do you think? I mean, should we be is this like a regular piece of content? I know you're talking about it all the time, obviously, but is this the kind of stuff that as more of these cases are coming out and where these decisions are coming down, should we be, going live and talking about it and being proactive on that front? Or how much should this be a regular part of our discussion with our potential customers?
If I were looking for content, regular content, I think for the next year or so, you're going to have regular, because you're going to have new decisions. You're going to have appeals. There's going to be a segment of your audience that's interested in this. And you can, new cases, there are going to be many copycat cases. It's going to have an effect on the real estate industry. And so you can get out in front of it and start talking about what are some of the changes that might take place. And so you hear people talking about, well, the buyer might not be represented in a transaction because agents might not be compensated for representing buyers. Now, I think that, like I said earlier, buyers benefit and sellers benefit being represented in a transaction. And so part of your story needs to be not only what are the benefits that you bring if you list a property and what benefits the multiple listing service brings, but also when you represent a buyer in a transaction, what are the benefits that you bring? And as representing a buyer, what benefits do you bring the seller? Because people don't typically think of that, right? That when you bring in an offer from a buyer, you've probably pre-qualified that buyer. You probably, right? You make sure that they're the right, make enough money to buy the property, that they've got their loan lined up. There's a whole sequence of things that you've done working with that buyer that because you've done it, the seller doesn't need to worry about it, theoretically, right?
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So this makes a lot of sense. And that's a great point too, that we're always looking for content. There's an approach in marketing, content marketing, especially, where you got to have something that's going to keep you top of mind with people, even when they're not thinking about real estate. And then when they are thinking about real estate, you want to hook them, right? You want to get, that's why you kind of have a mix of the two: community content, real estate content, right? Kind of good balance there. Well, what I like about this is that obviously there's probably a lot of general interest in these lawsuits, right? Real estate market's huge industry in the U.S., driver of the economy, people care. But people that are thinking about buying or selling a house in the next year or two probably care a little bit more, which means the viewers you're going to get on this stuff are the most qualified prospects you could probably find out there, right? So I think I love that idea, right? So instead of being kind of nervous or scared about this, it's the flip of that, right? It's lean directly into it, get out in front of people, share even more information than they're currently getting from some of these national sources, become the expert, and then lo and behold, people that have questions on these topics as the industry does change, who are they going to turn to, right? They're going to turn to you because you've been the one educating them on it. So that's great. Let's take it from the other side though, right? Because obviously we get out there, we start talking about content, especially legal topics. And I think one thing I'd be concerned about is, what are some of the potential landmines? What do I need to be careful to not say? Are there phrases I should be avoiding, or certain parts of this I should skip over that might be potentially dangerous? Any thoughts there? Is there anything we should be avoiding, you think?
Yeah, well, I think there is, and you have to be very careful that when you're talking to sellers, you don't say to them that you have to offer commission or nobody will show your property. That's part of the problem here. And so I said, well, hey, I just read you don't have to compensate buyer. I don't have to pay the buyer. I know you want to charge me X%. I would rather pay half of X%. And I read that I don't have to represent I don't have to pay the buyer's representative. So how would you answer that? Well, some people might answer it. They might say, look, yeah, you don't have to pay him, but if you don't pay him, nobody's going to show your house. That's what you don't want to say. Okay. That's very dangerous. And so you stay away from that conversation, because people will show the house. And that's the message that we have to convey. People will show the house because new methods of compensation will be developed. So if somebody says to me, I don't have to pay the commission, so since I'm not going to pay it, I think that you need to have this conversation about why it's in the seller's best interest to have that buyer represented, and not fall back on this comment that if you don't see, if you don't offer what everyone else is offering, no one will show your house. That's price fixing, right? That's kind of saying there's a standard.
Right.
If you don't offer what everybody else is offering, fewer people are going to show your house. Have you ever thought, you know, anybody's ever said that? And if you've been around real estate, you probably do know people who've said that.
Oh, yeah.
And that kind of leads to this idea that there must be a standard. And in real estate, we go to great lengths to say to people, there is no standard commission. Because if there were, we'd all be guilty of price fixing. And so to say to us, this is dangerous, to say to a seller, you should, I know you don't have to offer a buyer compensation. I know what the lawsuits say. Yeah, it's all, you don't have to offer. But let me tell you why it's good for you to offer that. Because if you don't, no one will show your property. That's the wrong thing to say.
Got it. Well, how would you explain it then? So, I mean, obviously, you know, are you still allowed to sort of make the point that it might get shown to more people and therefore sell for a higher price, or is that still kind of pushing them in the wrong direction?
Still kind of, I'd be real careful.
Okay.
Right. So the economics have a lot to do with it. What the market is, how, you know, is it a buyer's market or a seller's market? That has a lot to do. But I would lean on the benefits that you receive as a seller, having your competitor side represented by somebody else.
Okay.
And so if in fact those people don't get paid, then you're going to have people straggling into your listing without representation. And you really don't, it's not probably in your best interest to sell your house to somebody who's not represented, because you're going to take on more liability. Your agent's going to take on more liability. You're going to be responsible for the acts of your agent when they're acting within the scope of authority. So you really have an interest in having the other side represented. And we know that it's really not the seller that pays the commission, it's the transaction. Now, people will argue all day long, and I've been arguing with people for years about this. The buyer pays the commission. No, the seller pays. Have you ever had that conversation? No, if you don't have a buyer, you don't have any commission. If you don't have a seller, you don't have any commission. So what pays the commission? The transaction pays the commission. Now, somehow that commission has to be financed because people don't want to come up with the cash to pay for it. So it's all part of the transaction. And so as the seller, typically when you list your house for sale, you know there's a certain amount of money that's going to come out of the proceeds to pay the commission. And that's factored into the price the property is listed for. I know some people don't believe that, but that's the way it works. And every seller factors that in when they're thinking about how much they're going to net out of the transaction. And when appraisers appraise the property, because the bottom line is what it'll appraise for, because you're only going to get a loan that's some percentage of the value of what it appraises for. And when somebody appraises it, they don't say, well, it appraises for $500,000, but there's a commission. Let's subtract the commission. So this is what it's worth. They don't. They appraise it based on what it's sold for, which includes the fact that the seller, out of their proceeds, out of what's financed by the buyer, is going to go to both brokers in the transaction or both agents in the transaction. So move away from this idea that people won't show your property if you don't offer a standard commission. Obviously, people, if I remember in down markets where we offered incentives to agents who represented buyers, we actually gave them more. I remember giving away vacations, right, to people who would bring in buyers, because there have been markets, believe it or not, when there weren't very many buyers around. And so somebody who could find a buyer and bring a buyer in, that had a tremendous value. And there were markets when anybody could take a listing. As a matter of fact, and so I remember some markets where you didn't want to be the first agent to list the property. You wanted to be the second or third agent to list the property, because by then the seller was more realistic. And so we kind of wander away. There's so much to talk about when you're doing videos. And I go back to the idea that there is major litigation that's resulting in billions of dollars of damages alerts people to ask questions about the real estate industry. And if you take the time to learn about it, and there are many things you can talk about. You can talk about, how did we even get to an MLS where there was an offer of compensation? What was it before there was an offer of compensation? What's the history behind it? How are commissions paid and how do they flow? All expertise that you can bring and talk. What's the latest case? What's the latest piece on that case? What's the latest settlement that's been made? Lots of different pieces that if you just did a little bit of studying, not a lot, and you need to do a little bit of studying for any content you're going to present in a video, right? So and that's the other, there's an abundance of material. Don't get it out of social media. Read about it in the real estate publications. There's a number of good real estate publications that you can read, and study this and become, as you mentioned, Nick, become the expert, the person. And that doesn't mean you have to understand everything. It means you can report. You're a reporter,
right?
You're reporting on the latest. Have you heard the latest? Right. The latest is, here's the latest I read today. People would be interested in this, that the judge approved, it doesn't mean it's final, approved the settlement because two companies settled in that case. Anywhere, which is the company that owns big franchises, Century 21, Coldwell Banker, Better Homes, ERA, right? Anywhere, used to be Realogy. They settled for $83.5 million. Remax settled for $55 million. And the judge said, it looks like those are good settlements. Well, that's a piece of news. See, we're really talking about some news in the real estate marketplace. And so people want to know about that. Now, underneath that, that says something to me. If a judge approves a settlement of $83 million in a case where the damages have already been determined by a jury to be $5 billion, maybe the judge thinks that $5 billion is too much. And it's ultimately, it's going to come down to what the judge thinks and what the judge says. And so if the judge says, hey, 55 million looks like a good number, then maybe 5 billion, maybe the jury made a mistake. Maybe 5 billion is too much. So there's some innuendo and some nuance in some of this news. And what you want is, you're a real estate person, you want people to recognize that you're an expert in your industry, that you keep up with current events in your industry, and that you're not an attorney, but you certainly can talk about the current events. And the thing you got to be careful of is not to, they're using this word steer, right? Which is interesting because we use the word steering frequently in the fair housing area, right? And so now they're starting to use it. They use this word steer, and they're saying that agents that represent buyers are steering buyers away from properties where they're not being offered a standard, larger amount of commission. And so you don't want to be accused of steering somebody away from a listing because you're not compensated the old-fashioned way through the seller. And so here's something else I think is really valuable for people that are selling real estate today, is if you're not using buyer broker contracts, then you need to start looking at the use of a buyer broker contract. Because if you're not guaranteed the commission through the MLS the way that you are now, that's the first thing. Keep selling real estate the way you're selling it. Nothing's changed. You can still get paid the way you're getting paid. So don't be afraid that tomorrow you're not going to be compensated the way you've been compensated all along. So forget the fact that this is big news, but it's not going to change the way you're compensated tomorrow. You have time to get ready for these major changes. And one way you're going to get ready for this is to learn how to use a buyer broker agreement. And a buyer broker agreement is something you want to talk about. Hey, so here's an idea for a video. When's the last time you went over the offer to purchase contract? with somebody. There's a lot of great information in a contract. And how do you explain that contract to your seller, to a listing contract to your seller? How do you explain, hey, an offer is going to come in on the property, and when an offer comes in, here's what it's going to look like. And I would like you to be familiar with this offer now, so that when an offer comes in, you're not going to have questions about the, basic questions about the offer. You're already going to be familiar with it. So why don't you do a video on the listing agreement? Why don't you do a video on the offer to purchase? What would you put in that video on the listing agreement? Well, what do you say to a seller before you ask them to sign the listing agreement? What do you say to a buyer when you're explaining to them the contract they're going to sign? There's great content for video in those contracts that you use. What's a disclosure statement? What's in the disclosure statement? Why is that important? There's valuable transactional content, right?
Cool. Yeah, and it sounds like I think we're at about 15 different videos already we could be making on this topic. And I love the point that a lot of it just comes back to just being the expert, right? Just being the expert on the industry, educating people on how the process works. And it is true. Like right now, I mean, those videos will always get attention, but they'll get 5 times as much attention right now than they ever have in the past, right? Because it's a topic. Like, when does the average person think about the buyer's agreement you sign with a real estate agent, right? They don't care about that 99.9% of the time. Right now, with this in the news, they do, right? Actually relevant. So yeah, I love the idea of just kind of becoming like the news person. And really that's where, so let me go back to something you mentioned earlier, is obviously finding some reliable sources here. And there's some that are more reliable than others. Would you be willing to share a couple places you think people should turn for this kind of information that they can trust and kind of rely on consistently?
Yeah, so there's a newsletter that comes out, and some of this is subscription based, right?
Sure, that's fair. Yeah.
Real estate news, the Wave Group, WAV, they publish information about this. I would go to the Wave Group, probably.com. Inman, Brad Inman, Inman News, although they're very, very negative towards the industry in most cases, but that's okay. You want to read both sides to this.
Right.
There's a site that has a very negative, completely different viewpoint, but you want to read that because you can figure out positive sides when you read the negative, and that's the Consumer Federation of America. So go to the Consumer Federation of America.org and read their take. It's completely different than NAR. So go to NAR.realtor. And you'll find information there. I have a blog, website where I publish things on a regular basis about this, and it's thedataadvocate.com. So if you went there, and it's not a subscription site, I'd like to publish whatever I can publish because I have an interest in educating the industry. It's one of the passions that I have. You can participate. You have to be careful in the social media groups. You got to make sure if you're looking at information in social media groups that you understand the background of the people who are writing.
Okay.
And so I post frequently to Lab Coat Agents, right? We talked about Tristan and Nick and Lab Coat Agent Group and Lab Coat Agents Broker Edition, and we post there free. I post there frequently, but there are other people, and again, you have to be careful. There are people that post often in social media groups that don't really understand what they're posting about. And one of the things I like to kid about social media, but it's absolutely true, is social media is full of people who are not always right, but never in doubt. And so, just know that. People have got strong opinions, but they can't back it up. And so while social media can present a lot of great information, before you take it as gospel, make sure you understand the background of the person who wrote it and what their motives are, what their knowledge is, right? But you can get a lot of good information out of social media groups if you're careful.
Yeah, no, and I personally I like the discussions where you're getting a lot of input, because at least then you're kind of hearing all the different sides of the perspective. And even if a few of those people are coming out, from the wrong perspective, at least you're getting some of the sides of it, right? And I think you can then interpret that and kind of distill it into content that makes sense follow up on that, and this is mostly kind of personal curiosity here. Excuse me. We're obviously seeing AI start to emerge as a crucial tool. It's kind of popping up all over the place, considering it's growing like crazy. If I were to go to, like, one thing I like to do is I kind of use Chat GPT almost like a search engine, go in and ask questions. And now that it has internet access, it can share up-to-date information. What are your thoughts? Is that safe? Like, you ever use it that way, or is that another one to definitely avoid because it might be full of misinformation?
No, I wouldn't avoid it. I would use it. I would go
Okay.
there, but I would be careful. See, the thing about
Right.
for me, you need to know what you're asking. Right. So
Mm,
one thing is just learning. People should learn about Chat GPT, should learn how to phrase the questions, because the answer is going to be based on the way you ask the question. And it, and so as long as you have an understanding of the topic in which you're asking, you're going to be okay. If you know nothing about it and you ask the question, you could end up getting things that aren't quite right. And if you don't know enough to see that, that could get you in trouble. But I would have no problem going to Chat GPT or, Bing. I think that there's other solutions. Look at different AI. It's really language models, right? And I like Chat GPT. At the same time, I find often it makes mistakes.
sure.
Right? The things aren't quite accurate, and then I go back and rephrase my question. That's another thing. If you don't phrase the question just right, then the answer is oftentimes not going to be just right. And it's almost like it can imagine things, right? When
Yeah.
you ask
Right.
questions. But I believe I like technology and artificial intelligence, and
Oh yeah.
learn how to use it and play with it. And I would just say, be careful. Make sure when you're asking questions of the topic we're talking about here, that you understand a little bit about it yourself. And then it'll give you information that you can maybe go out and research on your own. So
Right.
yeah, use it. Great source of information, but don't
Cool.
use it verbatim.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think we've seen a lot of examples of people just taking the output and reposting it, not even reading it. Obviously, we don't want to make that mistake. So that's good advice. And I wanted to ask you that because I know you're the tech guy, right? And you keep up to date on all this stuff more than anybody else. So let me just, I have a question here in the chat I want to share over. It's just a detail thing. Judy is just asking to clarify one of the websites you mentioned earlier. So she asked, is it thedailyadvocate.com, or was there another one that you mentioned?
Well, it's the data, THEDATA, thedataadvocate.com.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for clarifying that. Awesome. Oh, yep. And we had somebody comment on that as well. So I do want to just mention here, as we're getting towards the end of our time here with Saul, I do want to make sure that anybody that has a question they'd like me to relay, please ask it in the comments. We've had a great discussion going on. I don't know that I've seen many questions that were not just part of that conversation, which is great. I appreciate everybody chiming in down there. But if you do have a specific question for Saul, if you want to put it in again, if you have already, or for the first time, put it in the comments right now. We'll see comments from any of the places that you might be viewing this right now, whether or not you're in our StreamYard room or watching it live on social media somewhere. And then I'll feed those over to Saul here in the closing minutes of our conversation. So as we're waiting on that, I do still have a few more questions. I do want to think a little further down the road, right? So right now, we have the decision. From what I've seen, the judge has not ordered any changes yet, though, to the way the industry works. And I'm not going to hold you to your predictions here, obviously, but do you have any thoughts as to what might be changed here, and maybe let's say the next year or so?
Yeah, I believe that what the Department of Justice is after is the elimination of the broker compensation rule in the MLS. That's what I think.
Okay.
So I think that the MLS is you think about the MLS, the way it works is somebody gets a listing. They've got the agreement of the seller to be able to compensate somebody on the buy side. Now, if you're working on the buy side, you don't have to worry about being paid. If you're a member of the MLS, you don't have to have a contract with anybody. You just take an offer in. If the offer is accepted and the transaction closes, you get paid by virtue of the structure of the MLS. And so that means an agent who is just got their license yesterday, if they happen to latch onto a buyer and they find a property and the transaction goes down, and even if they did no work and the listing agent did all the work, the agent on the buy side gets paid as much money as an experienced agent would get paid. That's part of what the Department of Justice is after. They don't think that's right. They want to eliminate the offer of compensation. And why do I believe that? Because I've been following this since 1983, number one. Matter of fact, when they passed agency disclosure laws in the mid-80s, I thought that was the time that people should start to pay attention to buyer brokers and buyer broker agreements and learn how to use buyer broker agreements, because I thought that everything was going to change. Matter of fact, I went so far as to create a course. You can't get this. It's not available anywhere. It's called How to List Buyers. And I thought it was so important that I put it on 4 cassette tapes. Anybody remember cassette tapes? And so what happened was the industry didn't change, and commissions pretty much stayed consistent, even with new technologies. And it didn't change because we have this MLS where one person gets a contract, and then anybody on the buy side, doesn't matter how good they are, how bad they are, if they bring in an offer, they're going to get compensated. And so I'm going to take you to this case in Boston, the Multiple Listing Service Property Information Network in Boston, in the New England area, primarily out of Boston. And they were sued, and they agreed to settle. And they agreed in the settlement, the MLS agreed to pay the plaintiffs $3 million. And that money, half of it would go to the plaintiffs and the other half would go to the attorneys, and also be used to create a legal fund to allow the plaintiffs to go after the other defendants who were the broker members of the MLS. So the MLS agreed to pay $3 million. And the MLS agreed to change the compensation model, which was $1 to 0, which means you could offer 0. Now, to me, offering 0 is offering no compensation. Would you agree with that? I mean, if I offer 0, I'm not offering anything.
Sure.
And so they agreed to go to 0. The MLS did. And the MLS agreed to include documentation on listings where the seller knew and understood that they had no obligation to pay a buyer's broker. So they said, we're going to make sure that sellers know they don't have to pay a buyer broker. We're going to make sure that you can offer 0, and we're going to throw $3 million at it. And the Department of Justice, which is not a party to that litigation, they're not on the plane. They're not a party to the litigation. The Department of Justice stepped in and said to the judge, don't approve this settlement because we want to review it. And we need 60 days to review it. Now, that 60-day review period has not lapsed yet. But what the point that it made to me is 0 wasn't good enough for the Department of Justice. So if going to 0 isn't good enough, what does the Department of Justice really want? And I believe what they really want is they want to eliminate the offer of compensation from the MLS. So if you want to represent buyers, you're going to have to get a contract from the buyer. That's what they want. They want the buyer to be able to negotiate somehow, right? Either through contract with their agent, with the seller. That's what they're looking for. So I think that the offer of compensation in time will disappear from the MLS. It will no longer be an offer of compensation. So how are you going to guarantee you're going to get paid? You're going to need to have a contract, right, with the buyer. And then probably what will happen is in the offer, your offers from your agent will include the fact that the seller pays your agent. Because it's not about ruling out sellers paying the buyer's agent. It's about ruling out the compensation being paid because the MLS requires it. That's
okay.
What they're going after.
Because that's the trust part, right? That's the part where the collusion is ultimately happening, right?
Saying, hey, we're all participating in this. We're all colluding, and maybe we're not colluding. But if the result is the same thing as if we were colluding, then we're right. That's a whole nother point. Is when they're antitrust lawsuits are judged, they can be judged 2 ways. they can be judged per se, and that is, we don't care what you say. We know it's colluding. The result is that it's right per se. The other is through something called rule of reason, where now let's talk about the end result and the fact that the MLS brings a good result and the consumer benefits and every benefit. And the judge, I don't want to hear about that. Right? That we're not even deciding that. It's automatically per se, you're wrong. Right? So two ways to look at this. In the Missouri case, and that's just a valuable thing to know, just to know the difference in per se and rule of reason, because you could do a little video on the difference in per se and rule of reason. Not giving legal advice, but just explaining the difference, because some of these cases will be ruled per se, and hopefully we'll hope that some of them will, and that's going to be part of the appeal of this first judgment, and that is that it really should be rule of reason.
Got it. All right, cool. Well, it's an interesting insight. So I do want to get you a question we have from one of our viewers here. This is coming in from Burnett. She's asking, is it safe to assume that more people will end up selling because they will have the opportunity to walk away with more cash in their pocket? So we assume kind of moving forward, buyers are getting compensated, or buyers agents are getting compensated by the buyer. Do you think that's going to affect, people's interest in selling?
No, no, I don't think that is going to be right. And I think actually there are impediments to selling. And one of the biggest impediments to selling is not the commission. It is the fact that homeowners have got such great loans on their property. And if they had to go out and replace the loan, because the loan you got on your property, my example is we don't have much of a loan anymore, but it's 3%. Why would we pay off a 3% loan and go out and buy a property and get a 6% loan or a 7% loan? And so I think a greater impediment to people selling is the fact they're sitting on great loans. And if they had to replace that money in a new loan, they'd be paying almost twice as much. That's an impediment. I think people need to list and sell. People need to sell property. People need to buy property. It's 4 to 6 million transactions a year in the United States consistently, year over year. Sellers always, I think, if they knew they could take home, if they had higher proceeds, that would be a nice to have, a nice add-on if I could have more. But that's not going. I'm not going to say, hey, now that I can get an extra 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, now's the time to sell. I don't think that's going to motivate people to sell. I think what motivates them to sell is they got to move because they got a new job, or they need a bigger house, or all of those things that are motivators to selling.
Right. Okay. It makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, we're still working with the same motivators and the same stuff that we ever would have been, right? And obviously rates are going to be kind of the biggest thing that has an impact on that. Now you mentioned, these fixed rate 30-year mortgages is kind of, this albatross now. Everybody has these low rates and they're not going to give up on that moving. This is a little bit unrelated, but do you see there being any shifts in sort of the way that the mortgage industry works moving forward? Since now we realize, okay, when rates do go back up, this whole reality of these fixed rate loans basically means nobody wants to sell their house. Do you think that's going to have its own impact?
Well, so I think certain people are going to have to sell their house, right?
Sure.
For one reason or another.
Gotta
They're
move.
going to have that. And then you've already got the lending world playing with adjustable loans.
Okay.
Right. So you're going to see that. People should learn about adjustable loans and how they work. And you might even see, we used to use seller financing, right? So we used to call it creative financing, right? Where we put a certain amount down, we get the seller to carry back a certain amount. And so maybe you take a lower amount of an institutional loan at the higher interest rate, but the seller carries back at a lower interest rate. That's kind of inverse to make the property more attractive. So financing is what makes it work, right? We got the greatest housing market in the world, and the reason we do is we have a housing finance industry, and we have a secondary market of investors that buy up these loans, and those industries want to continue and survive as well. But I'd also say that the lending world is changing, and so we know that there are major portals that we should pay attention to, because at some point you're going to see this bringing together of consumer, lender, sale, cradle to grave, from the moment someone's interested in buying a house all the way through, or property, all the way through the loan process, the real estate process. And what I would recommend is take a look at go to a website called icemortgage.com. And ICE stands for Intercontinental Exchange. And ICE, Intercontinental Exchange, is the company that owns the New York Stock Exchange. And we all know that this New York Stock Exchange is all about investing, right? ICEmortgage.com. And ICE Mortgage owns the New York Stock Exchange. And they are working on, as is CoStar and Zillow, a cradle to grave, hold somebody's hand through the entire process, which includes the loan and includes the real estate purchase. And this is going to have some effect on the industry. And the reason I mention ICE Mortgage is because they have some really great diagrams about what their intentions are. And what they want to do is shave the cost. Loans are expensive, aren't they? When you look at, real estate, there's a commission on the real estate side, but there's also commission on the loan side, points and fees, and then servicing fees over the life of the loan. And what if you could cut those expenses out of the lending process? That might make housing a little bit more affordable. What if you could do it? What if the loan process didn't take so many hands, so many people had to touch it? That would make it a little bit more affordable. So some of these big companies, they're actually looking at transforming the lending world. And that's something you could do a video on. And so ICE Mortgage, and the reason I bring up ICE is not only do they own the New York Stock Exchange, they just purchased Black Knight. Now, Black Knight they bought it for $13 billion. Black Knight owns Paragon. Paragon is the MLS system of probably a couple hundred MLSs. I know my MLS in San Diego, the MLS software we use is Paragon. And I bet you a lot of people listening to this, the software you use is Paragon. Paragon was owned by Black Knight. Black Knight is now owned by ICE. ICE has a division called ICE Mortgage. Now you got to tie from the MLS to a mortgage entity. That's worth studying and paying some attention to.
Interesting. Yeah, now we're getting into economy shaping stuff at that point. Sounds like, that's some high level stuff. I've heard some conspiracy theories, not to delve into conspiracy here, but that some of these type of entities might even be behind some of these lawsuits, because obviously the impact and the shift in the industry opens up some of these opportunities for these gigantic companies kind of get their hands in. Do you buy into any of that, or do you think that's all just kind of craziness?
No, I don't buy into it, and I'll tell you why. So here's the conversation. The conversation was CoStar. Okay. CoStar, big giant company. They own Homes.com. And Andy Florence, who's the CEO of CoStar, people think he's kind of a terrible guy and that they actually wanted to fund this. And one of the reasons was CoStar News did a press release that made the attorney in the Sitzer case their person of the week. Right. So who's the person of the week? They made, so it makes it look like, well, they must be cheering on.
Right.
Right. So now I then talked to Andy Woolley, who is I've known for many years, who's the vice president of industry relations for Homes.com. And I asked him, can you think about it? Homes.com, owned by CoStar, who people are saying might have funded this, and they categorically denied it. They depend on multiple listing services. Where does Homes.com get its clean data? They get it from the MLSs. Where does Zillow get its content, its inventory, its real estate? Gets it from MLSs. Where does Trulia? I mean, they all got broker's license. They get IDX feeds.
Right.
Having an MLS makes it cheap for these big companies to get the data to monetize it. If those MLSs went away, and if these lawsuits are successful and these MLSs will go bankrupt, if the MLSs go away, how are these big portals that are making billions of dollars, how are they going to get the listing information? They're going to have to buy it and figure out ways to get. So it's not in their best interest. It's in their best interest to get the data from the multiple listing services so that they can display it on their websites and sell advertising and sell leads and make all the money that they make. So the idea that they're going to go in and try to destroy the MLSs doesn't make sense to me. And then I asked them, and they said, "Are you crazy? Why would we do that?" Right? So I don't believe the conspiracy theories.
Good. Yeah. Well, I figured you were the one to ask because you'd probably actually spoken to the people running the companies and have all the inside scoops. So thanks for sharing that, just to calm a few folks down on the conspiracy side of things a little bit, right? Cool. Well, this has been great, Saul. I mean, we're getting towards the end of our time with you here, so I do want to just remind everybody, kind of last call here. If you have any final questions for Saul as we wrap up our conversation, we probably have time for maybe one or two more. Go ahead and put them down in the comments or the chat, and I will relay them over. So as we get to the end here, let's go short term again for just a second. It's probably my personal last question for you here, Saul, which is, we're heading into the holiday season, right? Good time of year for content, obviously. Then we're getting into the new year. Things are changing there. If I were to kind of lay out a little bit of a roadmap here for the next few months on a few different types of topics that I should be covering in my content, whether or not those are videos, I know you do a lot of video, or just longer form social posts, what do you think are some things we should be focusing on here in the short term?
Well, obviously there's enough of these cases where you could say each month you're going to do something, or each week you're going to do something on one of these cases, right?
Okay.
So that's something you could write. Another thing we talked about is look at your form library. What forms do you use on a regular basis? And do some educational videos on the different forms that you utilize, and explain particularly the things that are hard to understand. So I think that's valuable. And then look for neighborhood and community content. I used to run, and then I used to ride my bike, and now I walk every day in my neighborhood. And by being out 30 minutes to an hour every day in my neighborhood, I see things that I could do a video on, and they're of interest to a small community. But if I was selling real estate in my neighborhood, that would be the community I'd be trying to demonstrate the expertise to. So I would say get out and about, look and see what's going on. There are always things going on. Things as simple as they're repaving the main street and there's a detour, right? Just things that you observe. And so that's what I would create a publishing calendar where I would lay out the things ahead of time that I want to talk about. And then it makes it much easier, because if you have to come up with these things off, okay, what am I going to talk about today? It's much more difficult, and you're liable not to do it. But if you lay out a publishing calendar and you say, okay, there's 5 major cases, that gives me, every month I'm going to do an update on one of these cases, and I'm going to tie it to what I do in my business. Then you've got 5 months taken care of. There's other things that are happening in the real estate industry right now that you can talk about. Is the real estate industry of interest to people? Only to real estate people primarily, or people who are buying and selling right now. But the economics, what's going on in the economy, there are newsletters you can subscribe to. The FDIC puts out a newsletter. The Federal Reserve puts out a newsletter. I would subscribe to, and they're free, right? And subscribe to some of these newsletters. You'll get all kinds of ideas. I subscribe to one that's the Census Bureau, I think, and it provides a new housing report. And that's kind of interesting, the new housing. There's an organization called AEI, American Enterprise Institute, and they have a housing section, American Enterprise Institute.org. And go there and look at the housing section, and there's all kinds of information about housing. A great subject today that we hear people talking about is walkability. That it seems like a lot of people are interested in living in an area where they can walk to the grocery store and walk instead of having to drive. And there's the government is interested in having people drive less. And so developers are given oftentimes density bonuses if they develop in an area that's close to mass transit. And so there's all kinds of subjects that people would be interested in. And the important thing is to just pick out 5 or 6, do a little research, pay attention. I pay attention to what's going on in your particular area. What's happening with redevelopment or revitalization. Oftentimes when neighborhoods, when new mass transit goes through, the federal government through the state government or the city government will offer monetary incentives to people. So those are things that are of interest. So the key, and we talked about this, Nick, is consistency.
Yeah.
Right.
And
the way you're going to be consistent is pick out 5 or 6 subjects that focus on everybody loves real estate, right? It's a great subject, and there's many things you can talk about in real estate. Just pick out 5 or 6, create a calendar for yourself, do some research, and then, be consistent. That's the hardest part, right?
It is. It is the hard part. It's easy to say that, right? A little bit harder to do it, but you're sharing a lot of really good tips in terms of how to do it, which I think is, I always appreciate that, because you get a lot of folks, hey, go do it. But then the question's always how, right? So the idea of having this stuff mapped out, having your topics come back to, I love, one theme I'm kind of hearing here is to just basically be the reporter, being the person both in a national sense with the details and the nuance that your local following probably hasn't thought through. And then in a hyper, I mean, I love that example of, there's going to be a detour for a couple of weeks while we shut down a couple lanes on this one local road, and that's kind of stuff like the big time news locally doesn't even cover it, right? So, I mean, I love that super hyper local focus, being the reporter, being the newscaster, works every time. So yeah, great stuff there. So we are out of time, folks. I want to thank everybody for being here. Let me know in the chat what you thought of today's conversation. Should we ask Saul if he'd be kind enough to come back and talk to us again in the future? Maybe we can do another one of these inside of the school again here upcoming. But overall, just let us know in the comments, with what you thought of today's conversation. We're always looking for feedback. So that's all we got. We are here at the end of the hour. So thanks for joining us. And I want to say a special thanks, obviously, to you, Saul. Thanks for taking your time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today.
It's great to talk to you, Nick, anytime.
All right. Awesome. I like to hear that. We'd love to have you back again here in the future. So, all right. Well, thank you, folks. Thank you, Saul, and everybody. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. If you are based here in the United States, I know not everybody is, but enjoy your Thanksgiving, and we'll see you on the next one. We'll talk to you then.
Happy Thanksgiving.